Good morning, everyone. I will hopefully be able to talk a little bit more about why those numbers in the reports don't necessarily reflect the experience that owners are having. But first, sorry. First, an introduction. My name is Joseph Condon. I'm providing this testimony on behalf of the Community Housing Improvement Program. CHIP is a not-for-profit association that works with and on behalf of owners of multifamily properties containing rent-stabilized apartments throughout the city. CHIP's work consists of advocacy efforts, educational programs, and providing owners assistance with navigating the many layers of bureaucracy that bury the regulated housing stock. Currently, we have almost 2,800 members that together own or operate about 300,000 units of regulated housing. And before discussing the data in the reports and the data that Joe has presented, I just want to take a minute to talk about the difference between rent-stabilized housing and affordable housing. I think it has to be realized that affordable housing and rent-stabilized housing are not always the same thing. Rent stabilization was not intended to function as a subsidy to promote or provide affordable housing. It's not to say that some low-income tenants don't benefit from stabilization or that the need for affordable housing is not a compelling one, but stabilization is not designed to provide that housing, nor does it have the characteristics of a housing subsidy. There is no means testing to determine a tenant's eligibility to occupy a rent-stabilized apartment. A person or family of any income can occupy that apartment. There are no income supplements for tenants associated with rent stabilization, nor are there any built-in exemptions or abatements to reduce costs for owners who have stabilized apartments. Millionaires occupy tens of thousands of rent-stabilized apartments. Moreover, tenants with incomes of $100,000 a year or more occupy almost 13% of rent-stabilized housing stock, or roughly 125,000 of those units. Stabilization was intended to prevent exactions of unjust, unreasonable, and oppressive rents, and to forestall profiteering, speculation, and other disruptive processes that can occur during a housing shortage. While keeping those principles in mind, the ultimate goal of stabilization is the transition from regulation to a normal market of free bargaining between owner and tenant. These are the words of the statute itself. Thus, rent stabilization is not intended to be a permanent housing subsidy, nor to freeze rents for low-income tenants. The RSL actually recognizes that increases are warranted when they are reasonable, and where costs of operating and maintaining stabilized housing increases, it is only reasonable that rent-stabilized tenants also bear some of that cost. The RGB's duty is to arrive at a guideline that accounts for the increases in costs to provide and maintain stabilized housing, so that net operating income can at the very least remain constant. This is necessary to enable owners to continue to provide safe, decent, and desirable housing by keeping up with day-to-day maintenance, as well as making capital investments, upgrades, and improvements to their buildings. Essentially, rent increases are necessary to protect and preserve the viability of the rent-stabilized housing stock. Surprisingly, there have been some suggestions that owners of buildings with both unregulated and regulated tenants do not need a guideline increase because the increase in housing costs can be covered by increases in the rents of unregulated tenants in the building. This is wrong. First, not all unregulated tenants are in markets that would support enough of a rent increase to cover costs for other regulated apartments. And second, if this board is concerned about the preservation of the rent-stabilized housing stock, telling owners that their only chance to recover increases of operating costs is through unregulated tenancies will only encourage owners to aggressively pursue deregulation or sell buildings to those who will. Rather, this board should adopt a guideline rate that will enable current owners to keep up with increases in operating and maintenance costs so that these owners are able to continue providing decent housing to the residents of the city. It is not this board's duty to solve the issues surrounding housing affordability, nor could you with the blunt instrument of setting lease renewal guideline increases. Rather, it is the board's duty to allow these owners, these small businesses, the increases necessary to keep up with constantly rising housing costs. Housing affordability is an important issue, but it is not the board's issue to address. And if one truly wants to examine the issues surrounding housing affordability, it would be realized that affordability is not dictated by the stereotypical images of evil and greedy owners seeking to squeeze every penny possible out of their tenants. Rather, housing affordability is driven by the cost of providing and maintaining such housing, which are largely controlled by the government. To understand housing affordability, one must look to the economic pressures faced by those who provide the housing. The city's tax practices remain a troubling aspect of housing policy. Taxes are the largest expense and the expense which is growing the fastest. The PIAC report states that real estate taxes now constitute 30% of the budget of a rent-stabilized building, but it is not the only cost paid to the city. Water and sewer taxes account for about another 5%. Add this to the vast array of fees to the city for filings, permits, certifications, permissions, restoration fees, franchise fees, etc., and they constitute another 2%, which the RGB does not measure. This totals about 37%, and were one to consider city sales taxes as well, the number would rise to above 40%, meaning that 40% of the expense of operating a rent-stabilized building is just to pay the city of New York. Taxes and other payments to the city are a primary driver of affordability pressure. But now let's get to the RGB reports. As a statistical survey tool, the PIAC is severely outdated and accounts for almost none of the new government mandates which have accumulated since its inception. Accordingly, the PIAC only recognizes a portion of the costs associated with operating a building. It does not recognize the cost increase as new mandates are added, nor more importantly for the jump in the base amount from the inclusion of new tasks. In other words, it is not a matter of simply reweighting the current components of the PIAC pie, but a matter of the pie needing to become much larger. My written submission contains a list of recent city mandates that add increased costs to the operation and maintenance of residential housing. I'm not going to recite them, but I do suggest that you take a look at them later on. And don't get me wrong, we agree that the majority of those measures are part of meritorious public policy. We simply assert that this meritorious public policy costs money and that such costs must be reflected in the rent structure from which they are paid. Now the I&E report. The RGB relies on the I&E report to guide its deliberations in a specific way. The report is intended to demonstrate the general financial health of a wide sample of buildings, and by extrapolation, to demonstrate the financial health of the entire industry. However, there is a major flaw which unfairly skews the data. While the RGB's analysis of building finance recognizes rental value from capital projects, such as MCIs or IAIs, they fail to recognize the capital expenses associated with them. This is unbalanced and creates a severe misstatement of building finances. Revenues are ultimately overstated and expenses understated. Either capital items should be fully recognized for both cost and revenue, or should not be recognized at all. NOI is also overstated by the I&E report because it includes data from unregulated units as well as newly constructed regulated units that have initial rents set at the prevailing market rate. Although the RGB affirmatively asserts that NOI is a good indicator of a building's basic financial condition, it is not. The NOI reported is a thumbnail sketch, nothing more. By itself, and it is by itself in the RGB reports, it is insufficient to form a conclusion. No one would buy a building based on only this incomplete information. No bank would lend based on it alone. No auditor would exclude these full costs from their review. What will better guide this board is knowing the percent of building income spent on operating expenses, capital expenses, and tax costs. If the goal is to understand the buildings and the industry's financial performance, then other measures beyond what have been reported are necessary. What is germane is NOI after capital expenses and taxes and potentially debt service. Capital expenses and taxes are not discretionary. They must be paid, and they are an intrinsic part of the cost of providing a unit of housing. As such, they should be included. Imagine the reverse scenario in which capital expenses were included, but capital revenues were not. The outcome would be far different. How would tenants feel about so skewed an analysis? Would the board rely on such prejudicial numbers? And now let's look at the income and affordability study. In calculating the rent burden on tenants, the RGB report fails to exclude the value of major rent subsidies paid on the tenant's behalf. Primary subsidy programs, such as the federal Section 8 program and the city's SCREE-DREE program, are not included. The RGB does not account for the fact that a statistically significant portion of tenants do not pay a major portion of their contract rents. Instead, the RGB's analysis project the opposite, that tenants pay the entire burden, the entire contract rent. It is simply not true, and the board needs to correct its reporting to reflect the burden actually shouldered by tenants. If you take a look at some numbers, assuming 75,000 vouchers from Section 8, with a value of about $800 each, yields a rent support level of $60 million per month. For SCREE-DREE, assume 40,000 households and a $500 benefit, it adds an additional $20 million in rent support a month. But the RGB reports do not reflect the effect of this rent support on the rent burdens borne by tenants. It is particularly important because debate about the guideline often centers around the most vulnerable populations. But the board must reflect the reality that many of the most vulnerable are protected through assistance programs, which are more effectively targeted than rent stabilization or the guideline process. These are additional reasons why it is important to realize that rent stabilization and affordable housing are not always synonymous. In a continuation of this theme, although tenant rent subsidies are not taken into consideration by the RGB reports, owner subsidies in the form of tax abatements are. This selective reporting leads to unreliable results. Either both subsidies, tenant and owner, should be reported, or both should be ignored. Tax subsidies to owners have the effect of lowering the costs associated with operating a building. Reporting taxes in this way makes buildings appear more profitable. Rent subsidies to tenants lower their rent burden, as detailed above. By not reporting rent subsidies, tenants appear to experience greater affordability stress. By engaging in this inconsistent pattern of reporting one subsidy but not another, RGB overstates the income to rent ratio, rendering such data compromised. And looking at the city's population, it's at an all-time high. It's growing by 80,000 people a year. It's a vigorous rate, but to house them, the city needs to add about 30,000 units of housing annually just to maintain the existing level of supply. They would have to add many more to improve it, but nowhere near that amount of housing is being added. In the absence of such additional housing units, pressure on the existing supply will be exacerbated. In the context of the process under consideration here, it is useful to think what, if any, steps the RGB can take to address this problem of mismatched supply and demand. Certainly, strangling money from owners to pay for bona fide costs is not the way to do this. It will just make the problem worse. Accordingly, we recommend that this year's guideline be 6% for a 1 year and 11% for a 2 year. For many years, the RGB has discounted its own estimate of cost increases and provided guidelines which are substantially below the PIOC. As recognized by the Court of Appeals, the costs of maintaining an apartment and providing services to its occupants are often not in proportion with historical rents. Where the rent is relatively small and there is no vacancy for many years, the disproportion can become acute with small annually authorized increases that do not come close to covering increased costs. This has resulted in a negative increase in constant dollars available to cover operating costs. Accordingly, the proper response by the RGB is to provide a guideline this year which is higher than the PIOC. Thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony. I think I'm going to turn it over to Jimmy.
I have one quick question.
Sure.
So you helpfully provided two reports to me yesterday. One from September of 2009, I think attempting to expand on the data that you just described and to supplement the data that's provided by the RGB staff. And it's valuable, and again, we've had some discussions of the difference between the information that we're seeing in the reports provided to us by the staff and numbers that you're suggesting are more accurate. What's difficult, though, is this study that you provided and the descriptions that, again, I'm looking forward to seeing your buildings. I'm sure that you're telling us exactly what you're experiencing. It's difficult to generalize from owner self-reports and from some examples. And just spoke to Andrew briefly, and it's clear that the RGB staff has as its goal as accurate a set of data as possible. I hope we would all agree to that.
Oh, I don't
And
disagree with that at all.
I know you're not impugning anyone. So I'm just saying we all of us agree that the goal is accuracy of data. But the information that's not included in the data to date is not included because there's no requirement to report it. So it's difficult to obtain the data about financing costs, et cetera. So if you have any suggestions about ways to have a more accurate and complete provision of that data so that it can be included in the reports, that would be very useful, because again, I think we all recognize that the RGB staff has only data accuracy as its goal.
I am certainly not suggesting that accuracy is not the goal here, but I think some of that data is available. I think that tenant subsidies from Section 8 or...
I guess I'm more interested in the operating cost component of all of this, and your suggestion that the NOI is an exaggeration seems to be at the heart of your argument. So I guess I'm more interested in where the data would be available to help us understand your argument that the NOI is somehow overstated.
Well, part of that overstating is because capital expenses are not included and revenues from those capital expenses are included. I mean, one potential way would be to back out the revenues generated from the capital improvements, because...
But that seems to make the data less accurate. So is there any way to have an accurate reflection of the capital expenses, because that seems to result in more data accuracy on both ends, to have both rather than to have neither?
I mean, other than reports from owners themselves, I think it would be hard to find, and if you're not willing to rely on those reports.
Can I just maybe chime in a moment? When you're talking about capital expenses, you're mainly referring to MCIs, correct?
MCIs and IAS as well.
All right. Well, MCIs definitely are. Information as to the capital expenses are definitely available at DHCR, because when an owner files an MCI application, the owner has to provide the agency with evidence of the costs in performing that particular improvement. So maybe, and I don't know if the agency keeps these numbers, isolated, that you could actually derive some compilation, but perhaps MCI costs could be incorporated into this NOI formula.
Let me also add.
That's something that's able to be derived, I believe, because it is reported. It is something that the agency keeps records of.
We can also, last year, at the beginning of this year, the RSA commissioned a study by Urbanomics, consulting group that's very active in the city. And we asked them to take a look at what owners actually spend, including major capital improvements, costs, individual apartment improvement costs. So it turns out that the industry spends about $10 billion a year, or at least in 2013 spent $10 billion on operating costs, including improvement costs, as measured by, based on numbers derived from DHCR data that we, Freedom of Information, requested. And of course, about 30% of that total was just taxes. We know that we have those fixed costs. But we'll provide that report to you. I think it's more realistic to take a look at what the total expenditures are. And even more important, I mean, I think there were direct expenditures of $10 billion, and with a multiplier effect of, $17 billion worth of expenditures that generated jobs in the city of New York, supported local businesses, and in general kept our communities, our neighborhoods alive. So we'll provide that to you. But I think part of the problem here is a definitional one. I mean, it's in the city's interest when, and you know, it's in the city's interests to maximize its tax revenue, which means that they will, in terms of the reporting that they require from owners, they will maximize the income received, minimize the expenses, and arrive at the highest possible NOI, which is what tax assessments are based on. There is some outreach. This year, the Department of Finance requested additional information from owners. It was optional, but they wondered what owners might set aside for reserves for replacements. So I don't know if that data is available yet from the Department of Finance, but they certainly have some idea of what the expenses are beyond those that are requested and enumerated in the RPIE statements.
Thank you very much.
Can I actually add something, especially, again, as a newbie, just learning more about how the data and the statistics are available. I agree about the NOI reporting being, having sort of a dysfunction to it, not inaccurate with what is available to us, but not telling the complete picture. The capital improvements being obviously a major component of that, and Magda's right that the MCI capital improvements actually are reported. I don't know how they can match with the buildings. That might be a larger task, but for sure that it's a very close calculation of exactly what is being invested in the building and the commensurate rent increase because of that MCI. So there is a match of the revenue and the capital. The other aspect of the NOI that I have grown discomfortable about is the fact that the NOI includes unregulated units in its calculation. And Rachel, I think you bring up a very good point. We're given the data that we have available to us. I don't know if there's a way. I know on the DHCR report, every single unit, every single apartment in a building is counted for. And so if there was a way to look at NOI on a per unit basis that's isolated only for rent stabilized units, so units that are still in the rent stabilized program, because I do know that again, when you're mirroring data across reporting, I don't know how easy that would be, but I do know that unit by unit is calculated and it's designated as destabilized or market or stabilized. And operating expenses, and this was another great point that you made, it has no differentiation between whether it's a rent stabilized unit or an unstabilized unit or a non-stabilized unit. So you can straight line the operating expenses for a building across the units. So you have the revenue for each of the stabilized units, and then you can straight line the operating expenses because, again, there's no differentiation between you're going to pay the same on a per square foot basis or on a per unit basis, whether it's a rent stabilized or a unstabilized or non-stabilized unit. It might take some extrapolation to do that. It's a straight line process, but I think it's an unbiased way to isolate the NOI on a per unit, per stabilized unit basis, rather than this building wide, which has so many. It just seems, unfortunately, it doesn't give me a clear picture of what our charge is in terms of operating increases for rent stabilized apartments.
So I think this will be a really great discussion for us to have at 12:15, but I want to make sure that we give the owners an opportunity to continue testimony.
Thank you.
I'm Jimmy Silber. I represent an organization called SPONY, which is the Small Property Owners of New York. Our organization has approximately 1,000 members City from Greeks, they're Yugoslavians, there are a lot of people from the Caribbean, and they, by and large, bought small buildings with the hope that they would have a place for their own family. And they looked for space for their own family, and they bought the building, inheriting the other rent-regulated tenants in their buildings. Many of our owners don't even speak English. They can't possibly ever read any of the pages of the books that Jack produced that is fundamental for running a building. They're not, a lot of them are not educated. They didn't realize what they were getting into by and large because they wanted space for their own families. But the one common theme of all our owners is that they live in their own buildings. Almost all of our owners live in their own buildings, and that makes for a totally different community than where you have an absentee owner. These buildings are the best run buildings in New York City, simply because the owner lives there. My grandfather built up my building in 1930, I'm the third generation that runs it. I live in the building, all my aunts and uncles have apartments in it. I'm on a first name basis with all of my tenants, as are the other people in Silber. If tenants, have problems economically, they come and they speak to us, and we sit down rationally and we try to help them, and we work out a deal to ensure that they will stay in our buildings. This is the backbone of New York City. This is fundamentally who is providing housing in New York City. And the data released to you from the staff shows that. It shows that in 2012, from the DHCR rent registrations, there are 41,000 buildings in the database, and 29,000 buildings have less than 19 units. So these are the people you want to preserve in this city. These are the endangered species of rental housing. And you want to encourage them. A lot of our owners, like myself, have inherited our buildings. We've lived there, we've grown up there with our tenants. And you want to encourage that to go on. That is fabric of society in itself, that we all care about each other. We're co-residents under the same roof. And you want to encourage that. And that is a big job that this board does each year. When you come out with your deliberations and you decide what the increases are going to be, that is a fundamental input into small owners' hopes for the future. And all these years, since 1968, this board has been issuing rent increases, which is 46 years, 46 years of rent regulation. The average for a one-year rent increase over 46 years is 3%. Isn't that something? The board was created under the rent stabilization law to prevent excessive rent increases and rent gouging. Well, the board has done that. It's gone over backwards in doing that. 3% a year. There's virtually not one co-op in New York that can say they have held maintenance costs to 3% a year for 40 years. It's unheard of. Just unheard of. And now this year, the politics have become so much more involved in your deliberations than ever before I can remember, where the mayor, in his candidacy, is declaring a rent freeze. Come on now. This is bad for the hope of small owners. The example that Joe gave about this building on Wadsworth Avenue is sad. It's very sad. The owners had the building for 30 years, and they can get more money from the 2% bank account that they can from running the building. That's sad. That can't be. And there's no encouragement. And that is the pervasive thought of small owners now. If this board comes out with a 0% increase or a 1% increase when the price index is 5.7, you're sending a message that politics are going to rule. And we're leaning over backwards to help tenants who rightly need help, but we're placing that burden on your shoulders as the individual man or woman who happens to own that building. Why should that be in our society? Why should an individual man who owns a building be forced to have the burden and the responsibility of subsidizing every resident in his building. It's not fair. And it's done in a system that is so inequitable because there is not even a determination made if the residents, the tenants of that building need the subsidy. You'd think at a bare minimum, a resident under rent stabilization would be required to show that they need it, that they're in fact New York City residents and pay New York City taxes, that they participate in running the society of New York City, but we don't have that system. That's what makes it so hard for small owners who live with everyone in their building and see them every day on a first-name basis, seeing people who would go away for weekends to the Hamptons or drive luxury cars. It's like, what is this? I have 2 jobs to run this building, and I'm subsidizing people who are probably making more money than I am? That's inequitable. There can be a way to fix this and target the people that need help. There can be, and it's very easy to target those people who need help. There isn't one small owner in our organization that does not feel sympathetic for a low-income resident who's having a tough time. And we go out of our ways to try to help them. But let's identify them at least. Doesn't that make the system fair? So again, I have to ask you to think really strongly about a message that you're going to send. In all the years of the Rent Guidelines Board deliberations, the lowest guideline ever has been 2%. Even in the years of the Dinkins administration, when the price index was measured at being flat, nothing. 2% was the bare minimum that the Rent Guidelines Board ever went. That was the floor. So I think there's precedent set here. And I think what was realized during those years was that, look, there's an economic reality. Fine, we want to help. You know, we have a social conscience and we want to help those who can't afford. But there's a bare minimum. There's an economic reality in what it takes to run a building. And the price index, although everyone at this table can find fault with it and say the numbers are skewed and it does this and it does that and we can't rely on it, the price index releases data that is very relevant. It's underlined, highlighted, and it pinpoints exactly what it takes for an owner to run a building. And there are 4 components of the price index: real estate taxes, labor costs, fuel oil, and utilities. Those 4 components are a given. They're not negotiable. The owner has to pay them every year. The owner has no ability to negotiate with anybody about them. The city imposes them, and we have to pay them. Those 4 components take up 72% of the price index. 72% are costs that, as a small owner, we have to pay every year without having any ability to change it or reduce it. None. They're fixed. And the city, real estate taxes, the city takes back 1/3 of every dollar. To go back, 1/3 of every dollar of our income that the residents pay and becomes our income goes right back to the city. 1/3 for social programs, to pay fire department, to pay policemen. 1/3. So it's residents are contributing in rent to the owners, who are then contributing to the city in taxes, who are then paying for these social programs. It's a cycle. But if you interrupt that and you say, oh no, this year we're more sympathetic than we have been in the past, and we have to have 0 increases, what does that do to the cycle? It cuts it off. It's not, and again, you're placing a burden on the small owner who owns that building to be able to pay those costs or lose the building. And, psychologically, put yourselves an individual who owns. If you own a co-op, you own a house, you know what ownership is. There are fundamental costs in keeping that property going. You have to meet your expenses. Those four categories, which I say accumulate to 72% of the price index, if you just looked at the increases in those four alone for this year, you come out with 5%. So 5% is a bare minimum that a small owner needs to be whole, to be equal. Utilities, water and sewer, the owner has no control over it. There's 1 meter for the whole building. If a tenant inadvertently leaves a faucet open and goes to work, the owner has no control, but he gets a huge bill for water and sewer. He's got to pay it. And if, before this year, which we're glad the rates are coming down, we've had double-digit rates in utilities every single year, 12%, 15%, every year, non-stop. Fuel, something we have no control over. The price of a gallon of oil. What happens in the Middle East tomorrow is going to affect the price of a gallon. Owners have no ability to negotiate. We can do things like weatherproofing windows and having a great heat timer system in to regulate heat. But by and large, the price of a gallon of oil is what's going to determine how much we have to pay. And that is something completely out of our control, out of anyone's control. Labor costs. The 32B, 32J union just settled their contract for the next 4 years. Almost a 3% increase every year for doormen and supers. Completely out of our control. We don't negotiate it. It's done. It's done by the Realty Advisory Board and the 32BJ union. And they conclude what a fair contract is. But every year, since this rent guideline board has been issuing rent increases, there has always been a labor increase. The union doesn't say, well, we'd like tenants not to pay rent this year, and owners are going to have a reduced income, so we'll forego wage increases. It never happens. This is the real world. 3% a year plus benefits, health and pension. This is a fixed amount. So, you're dealing with owners that are operating on the fringe to begin with. They don't have a lot of resources to fall back on. And if something goes wrong in the equation, they fall through the cracks. Or they get to a point that Joe alluded to, where why are we doing this? Why are we fighting? Why are we battling every year? And the Rent Guidelines Board is rewarding us by talking about 0 increases? Why are we in this? It doesn't make sense. Put yourselves in our shoes. We get along with our tenants. We love our tenants. I get so many Christmas cards and New Year's cards from my tenants thanking me for providing a beautiful apartment for them, a beautiful building for them. They would be so sad if I told them I was selling my building. Because I would sell it to somebody who would try to convert it to a co-op or condo, remove the units from rental. That's the process that all these buildings go through eventually if they're in a decent location. And this board has an obligation to make sure that owners are whole, that owners don't fall through the cracks. I mean, we're not talking about huge excessive increases here. We're not talking about, what happened maybe in the 70s where you're thinking of 10%, 15%. I mean, what's our range really? From 0 to 3? I mean, is that logical range? I mean, that's not even mandated by what the price index is this year, because if you look at the commensurate rent adjustments, the 4 different types of commensurate rent adjustments, they give you a range from 3.5 to like 9.5. Last year, the price index was almost the same as what it is now, 4% and 7.75%. Look historically through the 66 years of the Rent Guidelines Board, there has been some sort of relationship between what the price index was and what the rent increases were. And you can claim all you want this year about statistics and this doesn't make sense, and that doesn't make sense, and that doesn't gel. But the reality is those four components that I gave you, taxes, labor costs, fuel, and utilities have to be paid every single year. No ifs, ands, or buts, or the on the losers of the board. That's it.
Thank you very much. We will have time for questions, if anyone has any questions for the
Mr. Tola, thank you for your testimony. You said you own and operate 6,000 units, right?
Yes.
And how many of those are stabilized versus how many of them are market rate units?
All of them are subject to rent
So,
stabilization.
so you have no market rate units of the 6,000?
Maybe 10.
And you said they're in the Bronx exclusively?
Our housing is from north end of Central Park, so Harlem, Washington Heights, Inwood, and most of the south and west Bronx.
And you said the range of the rent, you said it was from 780 to 935?
Those were the averages. There are obviously,
There are
there are
some,
some that are like the one I had mentioned for
Right,
400
right.
some odd dollars.
right,
There are apartments that are, 1,500 and 2,000, but most of the apartments are in that range.
right. That was helpful, thank you. There's another question? Yeah. Mr. Silver, I just, quick question. I really appreciate your testimony. You said you have 1,000 members, and how many units is your membership? How many units of housing do they own?
Well, as a conduit, all.
Yeah, well, you have 1,000 members, they,
Most of our members have buildings of about 11, 12 units,
right.
10 to 12 units.
And in total, how many units does this 1,000 membership represent?
Well, if you multiply 1,000 times 12,
Right.
12,000.
But some of them, like you have more than one building, right? You have one building, none of your members have more than one building?
Some have few small buildings.
Some have one, and some have few. Right,
But the key is that none of our members are big enough that they hire managers.
so they self-manage,
They self-manage, and they live in their building.
Right.
So it's a totally different thing
Right.
from an absentee owner, having 5 80-unit buildings.
Right.
Not ever being on the premises.
right, so it's really a much more hands-on approach, right? Right, and,
Name basis.
so say your units, how many of your units are market versus stabilized?
I have rent control, I have rent stabilized, and I have exempt markets.
And how many units do you own yourself?
16.
16, and how many of them are stabilized, controlled, and market?
I have, let's see, 3 rent controlled. I have 11 stabilized and 2 market.
That's helpful, thank you.
My question is to Mr. Zitolo. Thank you for coming and testifying and sharing with us a real-life perspective. I just want clarification on one of the things that you said about the city subsidized loans for repairs. You said that when your owners apply for these types of loans to help offset some of the costs to maintain the buildings, that the city requires the rents also to be at a certain level, so that ultimately I would guess you can pay off those loans, right?
Yes.
And you said that they have standards which keep the rents in line with reasonable rates. Could you explain a little bit of how those programs work in setting the rents?
This usually happens is we'll enter into a regulatory agreement with the city for a 30-year period. And we will promise not to take units out of rent stabilization, because even whether it's a tax credit unit or a home unit or any type of unit, they're still subject to the rent stabilization increases. They might not be able to use them, but they're still subject to rent stabilization. Usually city some teeth if we don't do what we're supposed to in taking care of the building.
But again, they require some degree of increase in order to facilitate the
Well,
payment
absolutely.
of those
I
loans.
mean, when you go with any of the programs, even if sometimes there are some programs where the city will offer 1% financing, they're still gonna look at a projection for 30 years and assume that the rents are going to go up on average 3% to be able to cover increased operating costs so that you can continue to pay your mortgage.
Thank you.
Mr. Toll, I was interested in this article you gave us around, the Cranes article you sent around about Stuyvesant Town and the attempt to deregulate a third of the units, 11,000 unit complex. So it's a concerning issue that we have, that there, in neighborhoods, maybe not in the buildings you own, but in neighborhoods around the city where there are rent regulated units, potentially hundreds of thousands of units over the last decade have been taken out of rent regulation. So, that phenomenon is something that, it affects net operating income for buildings, it affects tenants' security in their homes. How do you deal with those issues where we sit, as the Rent Guidelines Board, knowing that there are some owners like you who are attempting to preserve affordable housing, knowing that there are other owners like Tishman Speyer who are attempting to, whatever means possible, deregulate units and raise rents so they can increase their value because it's over leveraged and they pay too much for the building. So we have these factors. There are tenants who are living in lots of different circumstances in lots of different buildings under lots of different facts. We're trying to balance those issues for owners like you, owners like Tishman Speyer who are trying to double and triple the rents.
It's a big concern. I mean, I don't want to judge anyone, and everybody's entitled, to try and do whatever it is that works for them. We're very concerned because when people, a lot of investment funds and have had excess cash, and so they have people looking, I get calls, I must get 10 calls a day. Would I like to sell my building? I mean, it gets so crazy that one owner or one prospective buyer said, listen, throw a number out. It was through the broker, but they're just saying throw a number out. And what this does, and why I'm so concerned, is because the areas that we're located, it's mostly apartment houses. And if too many of these buildings get bought up by these funds who think they can do what Stuyvesant showed you can't do, as I said in my speech, they have a choice to pay the mortgage or to take care of the tenants, but they can't do both. The numbers just don't work. So we don't own by ourselves these 6,000 units. They're all small little 50, 60 unit buildings that have partners from 30, 40, 50 years ago. And I'm up against this constantly where the owners are saying to me, what should I do? I mean, I showed you the example. They can get 2% by selling it. I have, if you come up, I have dozens of buildings, old buildings that have had owners for 30 years. Maybe 10% of them do real well, and those are in some of the better areas, like maybe Washington Heights, but the buildings that are in Inwood, I have so many buildings where even with help from the city to do a moderate rehab, which also gave us a reduction in real estate taxes, I'm lucky if I can give out $10,000 to $12,000 a year to owners. The only thing that keeps some of them from selling is that they own 10 buildings, so hopefully, this year this building's not working well, the others will carry it. Next year, that building won't be working well. But this is a big concern. I mean, it's hard to make everything fair. You have a difficult job. There's no simple answers.
And a lot of these items, I think, fall outside of your purview. Just as you can do nothing about structural poverty in New York City. That's just not something that you're going to be able to do anything about. you're not going to be able to control market forces where there's a lot of money sloshing around looking for an investment. But all of these are sort of exception on both sides, on the tenant side in terms of affordability, on the owner's side in terms of what's called predatory equity in its worst case. These are marginal phenomena. This is not the bread and butter. This is not the affordable housing stock that we're talking about here. We're talking about Jimmy's owners, the Sponey owners, the Joe Zitolas of the world, the Chip, families that have been in the business for decades. This is what we're talking about, and I think it's very distracting to talk about these issues that you have no control of, that really don't affect your decisions. You have a blunt instrument, which is one guideline for the majority of apartments. And if we haven't already, we will continue to demonstrate to you that there are costs. I mean, it's obvious that the costs are going up for these apartments. It's obvious from the data that you have in hand that many of these properties are already in marginal economic positions. And your job is to help that majority of buildings, not to play around with these side issues.
No, go ahead.
I just want to respond to that bit about the issue of blunt instrument, because over the years, you've come to us and said, hey, we don't want to see a one-size-fit-all box, because the landlord who's got a rent that's below 400 or 600, 800, we need to look at them differently than we see the landlords who have rents that are higher. Why isn't that type of proviso appropriate in a situation when we see large numbers of market rate units, when we see private equity companies that are doing it? The second thing is, when you're talking about a small number, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of units that are being owned by these private equity companies. Just, what we hear today is they're calling you on a regular basis 10 times a day. They're calling all owners around the city 10 times a day, buying large swaths of property. This is an example of the 3-borough pool that was in foreclosure. And we're talking about 1,200 units. It's just one private equity company. 1,500 units in one private equity company, one portfolio that's in foreclosure. These are large swaths of property. One second. These are large swaths of property. So it is an issue that affects thousands and hundreds of thousands of residents. So it makes sense to protect the affordable housing we're talking about, but also respect that there's different types of ownerships and we should take different rules for different types of owners?
Well, let me react to both of the points you make. One, I think the current economic phase that real estate is going through is a self-limiting phenomena. Okay, another owner that I wanted to bring down to talk to you today is a colleague of Joe Zitolo's, who just took over management responsibility for that portfolio that you mentioned. And I can guarantee you, just as Joe took over 1,200 units and turned those, or is in the process of turning those around, this other owner-manager will take care of that portfolio. He'll turn that portfolio around in the same way that Joe operates his properties, and that will be the end of it. These things are self-limiting. And they're not, and they don't involve hundreds of thousands of units. They involve tens of thousands of units. So I want you to put that in perspective when we're talking about this. And in terms of tailoring the guidelines, the only way that the guidelines have been tailored over the years was by virtue of a low rent adjustment. That was an effective tool in its time. There were periods of time when low rent adjustments, for those of you who are new, were in place, and they applied to rents, initially rents below $300 a month, for instance, and they allowed an extra $15 or $25 above the rent guideline for those units. And the theory there was a very practical one. It was a recognition by the board that a percentage increase on a low rent does not produce the revenue that you need. It doesn't produce nearly the revenue as the same percentage on a higher rent unit. So this was an economic reality that certainly was within the purview of the board to address, because it had the effect of providing the needed operating income for the buildings that had low rent units. if you're willing to do a low rent adjustment now, we'd welcome it. I don't think that's what you're proposing, though. And the many other types of adjustments that you can make, potentially, I think are all essentially counterproductive or not indicated in the circumstances.
Harvey. Correct me if I'm wrong on any of these points. It seems that deregulation, the mandate, the laws, the formulation, all of that comes from the state. That isn't in our purview. We, as a city, have a more limited range of tools and mandates as it relates to rent-stabilized apartments, and deregulation is not one of them. And I understand your concern, and one of the things that actually I really appreciate about this board is that everybody comes from so many different backgrounds and can bring those backgrounds to this board. I have been on the investment side, a private investment side, not actually buying portfolios of rent-stabilized buildings, but that was the universe of private equity in which I operated in. There was a phrase that actually I think Joseph had mentioned, I thought was actually caught on for me, which was the deregulation incentive, which is where we as the city do affect deregulation is almost the it's the incentives and the disincentives that we have control over. So in the case of rent increases for rent-stabilized apartments, where we can impact the actual deregulation incentive is by, I have to be careful how I say this, how we consider our increases in rent-stabilized apartments needs to also consider that deregulation incentive. And that is actually where the city has a say. The rest of it's up in Albany. And when we make it much more feasible for people to have investments, private and nonprofits as well, to deregulate their apartments, because, not just because of the amount of equity that's in there, but because we're not in lockstep with operating expenses, then that's the only interface, because your question was, how do we as a board have an interface with that? And I think that's the only interface that we possibly have. Those are the tools that we have available to us. The other thing I was going to say, from just looking at it from a private equity standpoint, much of those, you called it predatory equity, there's still protections in place for rent-stabilized tenants. That stack that was produced over there, that didn't go away just because you have a private equity owner versus a owner-occupant or anything like that. So it's not, when you're thinking about the ownership, I don't think that that's as relevant who actually owns a rent-stabilized building in this equation. This is my personal opinion, because all of the protections and guidelines for the individual tenant in that space don't go away irrespective of who the actual owner is. So if a private equity firm buys a portfolio of rent-stabilized apartments, they then they are just as subject to those same rents, regulations, mandates, laws as anyone else. So they can't just kick people out. They can't nullify a lease. They can't do anything outside of the same laws that everybody else is subject to. So I understand some of the points that you're raising, and they're absolutely valid. I just wanted to clarify those points.
I think Steve might have a question.
Sarah, I just want to bring up one point.
Can I just make a quick
Okay,
point? Do we have further questions
Yeah,
for
I
the
apologize.
landlords, or is, because okay, great.
How many, you mentioned that your membership is basically on rent to Mr. Silber. And you mentioned that a lot of the owners are small owners, self-managing. How does union supers affect you guys, or do you have union super in your building then? And so you spoke a lot about those costs, and since when you mentioned, self-managing, I don't see that maybe directly in sync with unionizing.
any other questions for? All right, thank you all so much. We really appreciate your testimony.
Thank you.